poor girl hugs the wrong man. He was a millionaire, and he falls madly in love with her. Before we begin the story, leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The airport was crowded. Emily stood on her tiptoes, trying to see through the sea of people. Her older brother was finally coming home after months away, and her heart was racing with excitement. Then she spotted a familiar silhouette. Tall, broad shoulders, dark hair. It's him. Without thinking twice, she rushed toward him, weaving through the crowd, completely ignoring any sense of personal space. Emily threw herself into his arms, hugging him tightly. "Oh my God, I missed you so much." Her voice was muffled against his chest. Except his chest was firm, way too firm. And now that she noticed, he smelled different too. A sophisticated, woody cologne, far too elegant for her brother. A wave of panic shot through her body. The hug, meant to be warm and comforting, suddenly felt completely wrong. Something was off, very off. Slowly, Emily lifted her head to look up. What she saw made her stomach drop. The man she was hugging wasn't her brother. He was a total stranger. And not just any stranger. He was far too handsome to be just an ordinary man. A perfectly tailored suit, dark hair neatly styled, sharp and striking features. He looked like he had just stepped out of a fashion magazine. But his eyes, those eyes, gray like storm clouds, piercing like knives. And right now they were locked onto her with a mix of surprise and amusement. The silence that followed lasted exactly half a second before Emily panicked. Oh my God. She jumped back so fast that she nearly tripped over her own feet. "Help! I got hugged wrong. I hugged wrong. Oh my God, I'm so sorry." The man remained still, watching the scene with one eyebrow raised. Well, that was unexpected. Emily wanted to crawl into a hole and disappear. "I thought you were my brother." She waved her hands frantically, trying to explain. "He's tall and has dark hair, and I didn't get a good look. It was the reflection in the glass, the angle, my emotional nearsightedness." The corner of his mouth twitched. Emotional nearsightedness? Yes, when emotions are stronger than common sense, you see what you want to see instead of what's right in front of you. She swallowed hard, realizing she was talking way too fast. "Oh no. Shut up, Emily." Before he could respond, a huge security guard appeared beside him. The man was a wall of muscles, dressed in a black suit and looking at Emily like she was a potential threat. "Mr. Bryan, is everything okay?" His deep voice was stern. "Wait." Bryan, the name triggered an alarm in her head. Bryan Carter, the financial tycoon, the billionaire who avoided the spotlight, the man who had more money than free time. And she had just thrown herself at him. "Oh no," Emily whispered, feeling the shame reach a cosmic level. Bryan seemed to notice her look of despair, and he smiled. He smiled. "You look nervous." He crossed his arms, clearly entertained. "Are you afraid of billionaires?" Emily blinked. "I'm afraid of embarrassing mistakes being caught on security cameras and ending up on the internet." Understandable. She looked around. People rushed past them, unaware of the disaster that had just happened. I need to find my brother," she mumbled, still in shock. "And maybe change my identity and move to Alaska." Bryan chuckled but said nothing. He just watched her as she, completely mortified, tried to escape as quickly as possible. But as she walked away, she could still feel his gaze on her, as if he wasn't ready to just let her disappear into the crowd. And the truth was, he wasn't. Later, Emily was behind the counter, adjusting the glasses, when an impatient customer cleared his throat in front of her. "Excuse me? I asked for a cappuccino with no foam, and this has foam." Emily held back the urge to roll her eyes. "Oh, of course. Sorry about that." She took the cup and made a new one, handing it over with a professional smile. The man took it without a word of thanks, as if she was invisible. Just another normal day at work. She was used to it. Working at the airport cafe meant dealing with rushed, demanding people, most of them too rich to say a simple thank you. But she needed this job. It paid the bills and, most importantly, helped support her younger brother. She sighed, trying to ignore her exhaustion. Just a few more hours until her shift ended. "Emily." Her manager, Mr. Phillips, called from the other side of the counter. She turned, adjusting her apron. "Yes? There's a special order for table 12. Can you take it?" Emily grabbed the tray and walked through the crowded cafe, skillfully dodging customers. When she reached table 12, she opened her mouth to speak, but the words froze in her throat. Bryan Carter. He was there, right there. That tall, absurdly elegant man she had mistakenly hugged at the airport. He sat casually, one arm resting on the back of the chair, gray eyes fixed on her with pure amusement. Emily blinked. No, this couldn't be real. Well, look at that. We meet again. His voice carried a teasing tone. Emily froze. You. Yes, me. Brian smiled, intertwining his fingers on the table. And it looks like this time you're serving me. Funny how things work out, isn't it? She felt her cheeks burn. I swear this isn't stalking, she murmured. Brian let out a low laugh, shaking his head. If it were, I wouldn't mind. Emily held her breath. What did he just say? The tray trembled slightly in her hands. She tried to cover it up by placing the coffee cup in front of him. Here's your order, and have a nice day. She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. Wait. Emily paused mid-step. She took a deep breath before turning around. Yes? Brian tilted his head slightly, his eyes sparkling with something unreadable. Do you always run off so fast? Emily blinked. Depends. Do you always sit at the same cafe as someone who accidentally hugged you? He smiled. Maybe it's fate. Emily crossed her arms, or an airport with limited coffee options. Fair point. Brian picked up the cup and took a sip without taking his eyes off her. Since we've run into each other again, can I ask you something? She hesitated. If I say no, you're going to ask anyway, aren't you? Definitely. Emily sighed. Okay, ask. Brian set the cup down and looked at her curiously. Did you really mistake me for your brother? Or were you just in the mood to hug a random stranger at the airport? Emily's mouth fell open, shocked. What? He shrugged, feigning innocence. You seemed pretty comfortable. I might even feel special. Oh, for heaven's sake. Emily rolled her eyes, placing her hands on her hips. I swear it was a mistake. I had no idea who you were. That's surprising. She frowned. Why? Because people usually know. Emily was quiet for a moment, analyzing his response. There was something about it. Are you saying you're used to being recognized? Brian chuckled softly. Something like that. People usually look at me and see my money. Not that it bothers me. It comes with the territory. Emily observed the man in front of her. He was wealthy, powerful, but for the first time she sensed something in his tone that sounded tired, as if the weight of his reputation was a burden. Well, I'm not people, she said finally. Brian raised an eyebrow. That much I've noticed. They stared at each other for a few seconds. A curious silence settled between them, filled with something Emily couldn't name. Brian was the first to break it. So, you work here? Yes. And before you ask, no, I'm not pretending to be a waitress to investigate your secret life. Brian laughed. Good to know. Emily smiled, but before she could continue the conversation, her manager's voice called her name. Looks like I need to get back to work, she said, adjusting her apron. Brian simply nodded. It was a pleasure being your customer today. I hope we run into each other again. Emily hesitated for a second, then smiled. This time, without the wrong hugs. Brian smiled back. But as she walked away, something inside her told her this wouldn't be their last encounter. The following days were a strange mix of routine and anticipation. Since that unexpected encounter with Brian Carter, Emily tried to ignore the persistent feeling that something was about to change. But fate, apparently, had other plans. That morning, as usual, she tied her apron around her waist, pulled her hair back, and took her place behind the cafe counter. The shift was busy, customers coming and going, voices blending with the sound of the coffee grinder. And then he appeared. Brian Carter. He entered the cafe as if he weren't a discreet and reclusive billionaire, sat at a table near the counter, and looked directly at her. Emily felt a shiver down her spine. No, she muttered to herself. But it was too late. Brian raised a hand, deliberately catching her attention. Waitress. Emily narrowed her eyes. He did not just do that. The urge to ignore him was strong, but as the responsible professional she was, she grabbed her notepad and walked over. Mr. Carter, she said in a polite but sarcastic tone. What can I get you today? Brian gave a satisfied smile. A coffee. But I want it to be made by you. Emily blinked. What? I want you to make it. Personally. She crossed her arms. Are you implying that the coffee here isn't good enough? Not at all. He smiled. I just want to see if you're as good at making coffee as you are at giving awkward hugs. Emily felt her face heat up. You're not going to let that go, are you? Definitely not. She huffed, took his order, and went to make the coffee. When she returned, she set the cup in front of him and crossed her arms. Here it is. The best coffee this place has to offer, made by me. Brian picked up the cup, took a sip, and raised his eyebrows. Wow. Emily waited. Wow as in good or wow as in bad? He looked at her amused. Wow as in good. You really know what you're doing. She couldn't help but smile a little. Of course I do. I work here, remember? Yeah. But I have to admit, I'm surprised. I didn't expect someone like you to be here. Emily frowned. Someone like me? Brian leaned slightly forward, resting his elbows on the table. You have a certain spark in your eyes. A determination that doesn't quite fit a regular job. You seem like you belong somewhere bigger. She blinked, caught off guard by the comment. Well, paying bills takes a lot of determination too. Brian let out a light laugh. Fair point. But before Emily could say anything else, her boss, Mr. Phillips, appeared. The man, who was always strict and serious with her, now had a forced, polite smile. Mr. Carter, what an honor to have you here again, he said, overly enthusiastic. I hope you're being well taken care of. Emily narrowed her eyes. Brian looked from the manager to her. Actually, I'm being very well taken care of. Emily is doing a great job. Phillips' smile froze for a second before he turned to Emily with a sharp look. That's good. Then why are you standing around? Get back to work. Emily pressed her lips together and nodded. But as she turned to leave, she heard Brian say, Wait. She stopped. Brian clasped his fingers together on the table, looking directly at the manager. I'd like her to keep serving me. Phillips hesitated. Of course, but we can't leave other customers waiting. Then have someone else cover for her. The manager looked visibly uncomfortable. Emily glanced between Brian and Phillips, feeling the tension in the air. Mr. Phillips, I can keep serving the tables. It's not a problem, she said, trying to defuse the situation, but Brian just smiled and took another sip of his coffee. Relax, Emily. I enjoy good conversations, she sighed. What the heck was going on here? Phillips, clearly out of options, forced a smile and walked away. Emily, however, felt a heavy weight in the air. Her boss didn't like her, and now, with Brian specifically asking for her, things could get even worse. But at that moment, when she looked at Brian and saw the small, mysterious smile on his lips, she realized something. He was enjoying this, and that could only mean trouble. The tension in the cafe lingered for a while. Ever since Brian Carter started showing up regularly, Emily had noticed curious and mostly annoyed looks. It wasn't just her boss, Mr. Phillips, who didn't like the attention she was getting. Some co-workers whispered whenever Brian arrived, some with envy, others with curiosity. But Emily, she just wanted it to end. Why did he keep coming back? That was what bothered her. Because Brian Carter, a private billionaire with no time for anything, kept coming to the same place every day, asking for her specifically. It made no sense. It was a busy end of the shift. Emily was wiping down the counter when she felt a chill on the back of her neck. She looked toward the entrance and, of course, there he was. Brian Carter. She sighed, already expecting more teasing. But this time he didn't sit at his usual table. He walked straight up to the counter. I need a favor. Emily blinked, confused. A favor? From me? Yes, I want you to have dinner with me tonight. Emily almost dropped the cloth she was holding. What? Brian smiled. Dinner. You know, food, conversation, that sort of thing. Emily's eyes widened. Why on earth would I have dinner with you? Because I want to get to know you better. He leaned in slightly. And because you want to too, but you just won't admit it. Emily opened and closed her mouth a few times. You are incredibly full of yourself. I've heard that before. And you think I'm just going to say yes to an invitation like that? Brian gave a slight smile. Yes, because I don't take no for an answer. Emily crossed her arms, trying to ignore the flutter in her stomach. Well, that's your bad luck then? Really? He grabbed a napkin and wrote something down. Here's the address. I'll be waiting at 8 p.m. If you don't show up, I'll assume you're afraid of me. Emily took the paper, rolling her eyes. Afraid of you? Brian tilted his head, challenging her. You don't seem like the type to back down from a challenge. And without saying another word, he walked out of the cafe. Emily looked at the piece of paper in her hand, her heart racing. Great. What was he up to? At 7:59 p.m., Emily stood in front of the restaurant Brian had mentioned. She had no idea why she was there. It was a terrible idea. Yet, there she was. Taking a deep breath, she walked inside. The restaurant was elegant but not extravagant, sophisticated, yet discreet. It seemed like the kind of place Brian had chosen to ensure she wouldn't feel overwhelmed. She looked around and, of course, there he was, seated at a reserved table, impeccably dressed as always. When their eyes met, a small smile appeared on his lips. I didn't think you'd come. Emily sat across from him, crossing her arms. I almost didn't. So why did you? She hesitated for a moment, then sighed, because you provoked me, and I'm not the type to back down from a challenge. Brian chuckled softly. I figured you'd say that. The waiter appeared and handed them menus. Emily took hers and glanced at the prices. Goodness, I can't afford this. Brian didn't even look at the menu. I know. Emily stared at him. You know? Yes, and I didn't invite you here to make you pay. She narrowed her eyes. If you think I accept expensive dinners as payment for attention, you're very mistaken. He smiled slightly, shaking his head. I figured you'd say that too. Emily closed the menu. Why am I here, Brian? What do you want from me? He was silent for a few seconds, then leaned slightly forward. I want a conversation, a real conversation, no money involved, no status, just you and me. Emily crossed her arms, still suspicious. This doesn't make sense. You have thousands of people around you. Why care about me? Brian studied her for a moment before answering. Because you're different. Emily blinked, surprised. He continued. From the moment you accidentally hugged me, I realized you didn't care who I was. You treated me like just another stranger. She scoffed. Because I thought you were my brother. Brian smiled. Yes, and even after finding out who I am, you stayed yourself. You didn't try to impress me or get close out of interest. He tilted his head, observing her. You treat me like an ordinary man, and that's rare in my life. Emily felt a strange sensation forming in her chest. There was sincerity in his words, and it unsettled her. So you want my friendship? Brian looked at her with a playful glint in his eyes. Let's start with that. Emily sighed, picking up the menu again. Fine, but I'm choosing the food. Fair enough. The dinner was unexpectedly pleasant. Emily had expected arrogance, a display of wealth, maybe even boredom. But Brian was different from what she had imagined. He listened. He asked questions. He shared childhood stories and talked about his travels, but never with a superior tone. Just like a regular person. And for the first time, Emily found herself genuinely laughing. When dinner ended, Brian paid the bill without fanfare, and the two walked out of the restaurant together. The night was cool, and Emily crossed her arms, feeling the light breeze against her skin. Brian glanced at her and then did something unexpected. Here. He took off his jacket and draped it over her shoulders. Emily blinked, surprised. What? I don't want you to be cold. She eyed him suspiciously. This isn't some attempt to buy me, is it? Brian chuckled softly. If I were trying to buy you, you'd know. Emily rolled her eyes but accepted the jacket. They stood in comfortable silence for a few moments, just watching the quiet street. Then Brian spoke. I enjoyed this. Emily looked at him. This what? He turned to her, and for the first time his expression was free of teasing or provocations. It was something more serious, more sincere. I enjoyed spending time with you. Emily felt her heart skip a beat, and that wasn't a good sign. Because, despite trying to deny it, she had enjoyed it too. In the days that followed, Emily tried to stick to her usual routine. She tried to act as if nothing had changed. As if she hadn't spent one of the most strangely pleasant dinners of her life with a reclusive billionaire who, for some inexplicable reason, seemed genuinely interested in her. Ignoring Brian Carter was becoming impossible, because he kept showing up. Every day. At the cafe. At the same table. Ordering the same coffee. And of course, insisting that she be the one to serve him. He was doing it on purpose, and Emily knew it. That morning, Emily arrived at work with her mind elsewhere. Her younger brother, Oliver, had been complaining about pain for a few days, and she was starting to worry. He had always been healthy, but something felt wrong. She promised herself that as soon as her shift was over, she would take him to the doctor. But for now, she needed to focus on work. And, just like clockwork, Brian was already there. Emily took his order and walked to his table. You really don't have anywhere else to get coffee? Brian smiled, taking the cup she placed in front of him. I have plenty of options, but I like it here. I doubt that. And I like your company. Emily sighed. You really don't give up, do you? Not at all. She crossed her arms, narrowing her eyes. What do you get out of this? Brian took a sip of his coffee before answering. I already told you. I like talking to you. It's refreshing. Emily rolled her eyes. You make it sound like I'm a summer breeze. Something like that. He smiled. Emily didn't want to smile back, but she did anyway. At the end of her shift, Emily rushed to pick up Oliver. When they arrived at the hospital, a doctor saw them right away. And that's when everything changed. Your brother has a kidney problem, the doctor said, looking at the test results. He'll need ongoing treatment and possibly a more serious procedure. Emily felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. But he's always been healthy. These things happen, but if we treat it quickly, he has a good chance of recovering fully. And how much will it cost? The doctor hesitated. And when he finally said the number, Emily felt her stomach drop. She didn't have that kind of money. Not even close. Oliver noticed her expression and took her hand. Emily, don't worry. She blinked back tears and forced a smile. It's gonna be okay. But the truth? She had no idea how she was going to pay for it. The next day, Emily arrived at work more exhausted than ever. And of course, Brian noticed right away. "What happened?" he asked as soon as she served his coffee. "Nothing." "Emily," he looked her in the eyes. "Tell me." She hesitated, and then for the first time she told him. About Oliver. About the diagnosis. About the treatment she couldn't afford. Brian listened in silence. When she finished, he set his cup down and said, "I'll pay for the treatment." Emily froze. "What? I'll pay?" "No debt. No favors. Just because I can and because I want to help." Emily stood up abruptly. "No." Brian frowned. "Emily, I don't take money from anyone. I'm not a charity case." Brian leaned forward. "This isn't charity. It's a gesture. And I don't want your gesture." She turned to leave, but he caught her wrist. "Then let's make a deal." Emily hesitated. "What kind of deal?" Brian slowly let go of her wrist. "You cook for me for a week. I'll pay for your time, enough to cover the medical expenses." Emily's eyes widened. "Cook for you?" "Yes, at my apartment, 3 meals a day, 7 days. She blinked, processing it. "This sounds like a weird deal. Think what you want, but that's my offer." Emily hesitated. She hated accepting help, but she loved her brother more than anything. She swallowed hard, and then she said the only thing she could. "Deal." Emily had no idea what she was getting herself into. The moment she agreed to Brian's deal, she thought it would be simple. Cook 3 meals a day for a week. Easy, right? Wrong. Because the next day, when she arrived at the address Brian had given her, she realized her mistake. The building was a modern tower, guarded by security, with an entrance made of towering glass doors. The doorman looked at her like she didn't belong there, but as soon as she mentioned Brian Carter's name, she was escorted to a private elevator. When the doors opened, Emily was stunned. The apartment was enormous, the kind of place she had only seen in magazines. A sleek, minimalist space with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking view of the city. And Brian was there, sitting on a black leather couch, holding a cup of coffee, as if this was the most normal thing in the world. "Welcome," he said casually. Emily crossed her arms. "Okay, this is ridiculous." Brian raised an eyebrow. "What's ridiculous?" She gestured around. This apartment, this view, this decor that looks way too expensive to exist," Brian smirked. "Did you expect something different?" "Yes, I was expecting a normal place, not a mansion in the sky," he shrugged. "If you prefer, we can eat in the kitchen." Emily closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. "Never mind. Where am I supposed to cook?" Brian pointed toward a door. "Over there." She followed his gaze and nearly had a meltdown. The kitchen looked like something out of a gourmet TV show. Everything sparkled. The stove was massive, the cabinets were sleek, even the utensils looked expensive. She turned to him, incredulous. "Have you ever even used this kitchen?" Brian smiled. "Of course, I've walked through it a few times." Emily rolled her eyes. "Great. I work in a tiny cafe and now I have to cook in a 5-star restaurant." "Can you handle it?" he teased. She pointed a finger at him. "I take on challenges, but if you become a difficult customer, I'll throw the pan at you." Brian laughed. "Fair enough." The first few days were strange. Emily would wake up early and head straight to Brian's apartment. She prepared breakfast, had lunch alone in the kitchen while he worked in another room, and then made dinner. He never told her what he wanted to eat. "Surprise me," he'd say every day. And Emily hated to admit it, but she was starting to enjoy the challenge. Gradually, she got used to the luxurious environment, the high-end ingredients, and the apartment's silence. But the strangest part? Brian started spending more time in the kitchen with her. At first, it was just him grabbing a coffee. Then he began sitting at the counter watching her cook, and eventually they started talking. "Why did you choose to be a waitress?" he asked casually one night while she was chopping vegetables. Emily scoffed. "I didn't choose it. I needed a job. And what would have been the right choice?" She hesitated. "I don't know. Something I enjoyed. But not everyone has the luxury of choosing." Brian was silent for a moment, then said, "What if you did?" Emily stopped chopping and looked at him. "Why do you care?" He gave a small smile. "Because I have everything money can buy. But I've never had the freedom to choose something I truly wanted." Emily hadn't expected that answer, and for the first time she realized something about Brian Carter. Maybe he was just as much a prisoner of his own life as she was. On the 5th day of the week, Brian did something unexpected. He left a dress on the kitchen counter while she was preparing dinner. Emily looked at the luxurious fabric and then at him. "What's this?" "A dress, obviously. But why?" Brian leaned against the counter. "I have a charity event tomorrow night. I want you to come with me." Emily froze. "What? It'll be fun. Have you lost your mind? Brian smiled. Probably. She picked up the dress, still in disbelief. I can't go. I don't belong in your world, Brian. He leaned slightly forward. And why not? Emily felt her stomach twist. This man, he was dangerous. Not in the traditional sense, but the kind that made her question things she had never questioned before. And in that moment, she realized something unsettling. She wanted to go, but that meant admitting Brian Carter was getting under her skin. And that was a problem. The next night, Emily was in Brian's car on the way to the event. The dress fit perfectly, and when she stepped out of her room, Brian froze. What? She asked, uncomfortable. He blinked, seeming to regain his composure. Nothing. You just look beautiful. Emily felt her heart race. You say that to everyone? He smiled. No. She didn't know how to respond to that, so she pretended she hadn't heard. When they arrived at the event, all heads turned. Emily immediately felt out of place. The guests were dressed in designer clothes. Women scrutinized her as if she didn't belong. And then came the worst part. Brian's ex-girlfriend, Isabella. Tall, blonde, elegant. She looked Emily up and down and smiled condescendingly. Brian, what a surprise to see you here. And with such an interesting companion. Emily felt her anger rise. But before she could say anything, Brian intertwined his fingers with hers. She's not my companion, he said casually. She's my guest. And if you have a problem with that, maybe you should find another table. Emily froze, because for the first time Brian was standing up for her, and something inside her shifted. She looked at him, and for the first time, she allowed herself to admit it. She liked him, much more than she should. Emily could still feel Brian's fingers intertwined with hers. His response to Isabella echoed in her mind, as did the surprised looks from the ex-girlfriend and all the other guests around them. She didn't know why it affected her so much, but her heart was pounding. Why did Brian care so much about protecting her? They barely knew each other. Or maybe, in some way, he saw her differently? Come on, let's get something to drink, he murmured, letting go of her hand, but staying close enough to make sure no one would dare look down on her again. Emily just nodded, trying to ignore the discomfort of being surrounded by people who clearly didn't think she belonged there. She never imagined stepping into Brian's world. And honestly, she wasn't sure she wanted to be there. But when she looked at him, the way his gray eyes studied her, as if making sure she was okay, she felt something strange. Maybe, just maybe, she wanted to be by his side, even if it was a mistake. The next day, Emily's name was in all the newspapers. She didn't have to look it up to know. The moment she walked into the cafe for her shift, all her coworkers stared at her with expressions ranging from surprise to envy to judgment. Emily, were you at an event with Brian Carter? And that dress? Where did it come from? Did he buy it for you? Do you realize Isabella posted about you on Instagram? She wanted to disappear. She grabbed her phone and, out of pure curiosity, or maybe masochism, opened social media. The first thing she saw was a picture of her and Brian together. The second thing? The comments. Who is this nobody? Looks like Brian fell into a gold digger's trap. She's probably just another one he'll toss aside in a few days. Emily felt her stomach turn. She didn't want this. She never wanted attention, stares, or gossip. And now, she was right in the middle of it. Her eyes burned as she shoved her phone into her bag, trying to ignore the giggles around her. But her patience was wearing thin. Brian showed up at the cafe at the end of the day. Emily saw him walk in. Confident steps, calm expression. He was used to this, to being judged, watched, talked about. But she wasn't. And in that moment, she felt anger. As soon as he reached the counter, she leaned forward and murmured, "We need to talk." Brian raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Here? No. He saw the seriousness in her face and nodded. Let's go somewhere quieter. 10 minutes later, they were at a nearby park. Emily didn't waste any time. Do you have any idea what you did? Brian tilted his head. I defended you. No, you threw me into your world. And I don't want to be in it, Brian. He was silent for a moment. Then he sighed. Is that what's bothering you? Or is it what people are saying? Emily closed her eyes for a second, trying to contain her frustration. I don't want to be a scandal. I don't want to be a headline. I just want my normal life. Brian studied her carefully. And then, he said something that took her breath away. But you never wanted a normal life, Emily. She blinked, stunned. What? You've always wanted more. You've always had dreams. You've always wanted something beyond what you were given. But now, because a few people are criticizing you, you're scared. Emily felt a lump in her throat. Because deep down, he was right. But she didn't want to admit it. And that's when Brian made his biggest mistake of the night. He reached out to touch her, but Emily pulled back abruptly. It was instinct, automatic, but enough to make Brian's expression change completely. For a brief second, he looked hurt. Emily swallowed hard. I need to go. And before he could say anything, she turned and walked away, leaving behind something she couldn't explain, something that, somehow, felt like it was falling apart. Emily spent the next day trying not to think about Brian, trying to forget his eyes, the way he had seen her fears so clearly. But forgetting Brian Carter was impossible, especially when that afternoon, as she wiped down the cafe counter, she heard a name that made her freeze. The Carter Corporation bought up several businesses years ago, including that restaurant that shut down downtown. Emily felt her heart stop. She turned to the coworker speaking and forced herself to ask, "What?" The woman looked at her, surprised. "Carter Corporation. They bought up a bunch of places and caused bankruptcies, including that old restaurant your family used to own." "You didn't know?" Emily couldn't breathe, because she knew exactly what they were talking about. Years ago, her family had to close the restaurant her parents had built with so much effort, the place that had been the heart of her childhood. And now, after all this time, she was finding out that Brian Carter's company was responsible for it. Anger rushed through her, and at that moment she knew she needed answers. Emily didn't think twice. She jumped into a cab and went straight to Brian's apartment. When he opened the door and saw her expression, he knew something was wrong. "Emily, it was you," she blurted out. "Your company destroyed my family's restaurant." The silence was deafening. Brian didn't deny it, and that was worse than anything else. Emily took a step back, feeling her chest tighten. "It was just a game to you, wasn't it? You knew from the beginning." "That's not true." His voice was more serious than ever. "Emily, listen to me." "No, I don't want to hear anything." She couldn't handle it. The Brian she knew, the man who challenged her, made her laugh, and stirred feelings she didn't want to admit, was the same man who had destroyed a part of her history. And at that moment, something inside her broke. Emily looked at him one last time. Then she walked away, without looking back. But deep down, she knew this wasn't the end. Emily didn't look back. As she walked down the stairs of Brian's luxurious building, she felt tears stinging her eyes but refused to let them fall. She was furious, hurt. She had trusted him, and he knew. From the start, Brian knew his company was responsible for ruining her family's restaurant, and yet he had never said a word. What else was he hiding? The fragile trust that had been growing between them was shattered in seconds. She hailed a cab and went home. When she entered the small apartment she shared with Oliver, she found her brother sprawled on the couch watching TV. "You okay?" He frowned, noticing her face. Emily forced a smile. "Sure, just tired." But Oliver didn't seem convinced. "Are you sure? You never come home looking this upset." She took a deep breath and tried to push her emotions aside. "I'm fine, Ollie. Want to have dinner?" He nodded, but Emily knew he was still watching her with suspicion. She didn't want Oliver to know anything. The last thing he needed was to worry about the mess her life had become. The following days were strange. Brian disappeared. He didn't show up at the cafe. He didn't text. Nothing. And Emily tried to convince herself that this was a good thing. But every time she walked into the cafe and saw the empty table where he used to sit, she felt an uncomfortable pang in her chest. She shouldn't care. He had lied to her. He had deceived her. So why did she miss him so much? She threw herself into work, trying to occupy her mind. But deep down, she knew something inside her was broken. And the worst part? She didn't know how to fix it. A week later, Emily was closing the cafe when she heard someone walk in. "We're closed," she said without looking up. "I know, but I needed to talk to you." Her heart stopped. She knew that voice. She turned slowly, and there he was. Brian. He looked different. Tired. The usual confident sparkle in his eyes was gone. There was a weight to him. Something broken. Emily didn't want to hear anything, but at the same time, she wanted to hear everything. "Please just listen to me." His voice was hoarse. Emily crossed her arms. "Say what, Brian? That you knew from the start that you got close to me out of guilt?" He closed his eyes for a second and shook his head. "It wasn't like that." "Then explain." Brian took a deep breath. "I didn't know about your family's restaurant until a few days ago. I don't handle all the company acquisitions, Emily, and when I found out, believe me, I was just as shocked." She wanted to believe him, but it was hard. Very hard. "Why should I trust you?" Brian hesitated. Then he said the only thing he could. "Because I never lied about how I feel about you." Emily's breath caught. She didn't want to hear that, But at the same time, she desperately wanted it to be true. Brian took a step closer. "I never wanted you to hate me, Emily. But if that's the price of telling you the truth, I'll accept it." She didn't know what to say. Before she could respond, he placed an envelope on the table. "This is for you." Emily frowned. "What is it?" Brian didn't answer. He just looked at her one last time and left. When Emily opened the envelope, she was speechless. It was a contract, and with it, the deed to her family's restaurant. Brian had bought it back and put it in her name. Her legs almost gave out. Her family's restaurant. It was hers again. Let's do a little experiment for those who only read comments. Type Coca-Cola in the comments. Only those who make it this far will understand. Now back to the story. Brian had given it back, without asking for anything in return, and at that moment, Emily realized something. He was trying to fix the past. Emily couldn't sleep that night. She spent hours staring at the contract, overwhelmed by emotions. And for the first time, she knew what she needed to do. The next morning, she went to Brian's apartment. When he opened the door, he looked surprised to see her there. Emily walked in before he could say anything. She looked him in the eyes, and then she did something even she didn't expect. She hugged him. Brian froze for a second. Then, slowly, he hugged her back. Emily closed her eyes, taking in his woody scent, feeling the truth of that moment. "Thank you," she whispered. Brian pulled her closer. "I just wanted you to have what was always yours." She pulled back slightly and looked at him. "Does this change things?" Brian was silent for a moment. Then he said the only thing that mattered. "It only changes if you want it to." Emily felt her heart race, because, in that moment, she knew the answer. And when Brian leaned in slowly, their lips almost touching, she didn't pull away. Because for the first time, she wanted this. She wanted him, and there was nothing left to deny it. Emily never imagined her life would change so drastically in such a short time. She had spent years fighting to survive, balancing work, bills, and the responsibility of taking care of Oliver. She never had time for dreams, never allowed herself to believe she could have more than what she had. But now, holding the contract for the restaurant Brian had given back to her, she felt something different, something new. She was facing a choice. She could accept what Brian had done and move forward, rebuilding her family's restaurant and leaving him behind. Or she could face what she was truly feeling for him. Because no matter how much she tried to deny it, the truth was that Brian Carter affected her in a way no one else ever had. He challenged her, frustrated her, but also made her laugh. He wasn't perfect, but he was someone who, despite everything, seemed willing to change for her. And that scared her more than anything. She needed time. She needed to think. So, she did what she always did when she needed to clear her mind. She went home, hugged Oliver, and pretended her life wasn't completely upside down. But the universe, it seemed, wasn't willing to give her that time. That night, a phone call changed everything. The phone rang late, and Emily's heart pounded when she saw it was from the hospital. She answered quickly, already feeling a chill down her spine. The doctor's voice was serious, professional, but filled with urgency. Oliver had taken a turn for the worse, and they needed her to come immediately. Emily felt her legs weaken. She grabbed her bag and ran out the door, not even realizing she was shaking. Fear consumed her. She reached the hospital in record time, running down the halls until she found the doctor who had called. He explained that Oliver had suffered a sudden crisis and needed an urgent procedure. His kidney condition had worsened, and without surgery, he was in real danger. Panic took over. All she could think was that she couldn't lose her brother. He was her family, the one thing that truly mattered. But the surgery was expensive, very expensive. And even with the money she had saved, it wouldn't be enough. Emily collapsed into a chair, burying her face in her hands. She didn't know what to do. There was no time to think, no time to plan. Then only one person came to mind. She grabbed her phone and without hesitation dialed Brian's number. He answered on the second ring. "Emily," his voice was full of concern. She tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Her breath was shaky, the desperation clear on her face. "Oliver, he needs surgery. I don't have enough money." There was silence on the other end. Then Brian said something that sent relief flooding through her. "I'm on my way to the hospital now." She couldn't explain what she felt in that moment. But when he arrived, wearing a coat over his always impeccable shirt, his gray eyes filled with unwavering determination, Emily knew she wasn't alone. Brian didn't hesitate. He spoke with the doctor, signed the papers, and made sure Oliver got the best treatment possible. Emily wanted to argue, wanted to say she didn't need his money, that she didn't want to owe him anything. But right now, the only thing that mattered was Oliver's life. The surgery took hours. Emily sat in the waiting room, her legs restless, her heart pounding. Brian stayed by her side the entire time, saying nothing. Just holding her hand when she needed it, respecting her silence when words failed her. When the doctor finally appeared and said the surgery had been a success, Emily felt the tears fall down her face. The relief was so overwhelming she almost collapsed. And then, for the first time, she allowed herself to hug Brian without fear. It was a different kind of hug. Not one of desperation, and not a mistake like the one at the airport. This was a hug filled with gratitude, something growing inside her that she couldn't ignore anymore. "Thank you." Her voice was choked with emotion. Brian held her tighter, his strong arms wrapping around her in a way that made her feel safe. Always. She didn't know what that moment meant, but she knew that after this, nothing would be the same. In the following days, Oliver recovered slowly. Emily spent every minute by his side, making sure he was okay. Brian kept helping, organizing everything without expecting anything in return. He never brought up the money or made it seem like he was owed something, and that confused her even more. Because, for the first time, she realized Brian Carter wasn't the man she thought he was. Maybe he never had been. One evening, while Oliver was sleeping in the hospital, Emily went outside for some air. She sat on a bench in the garden, hugging her knees to her chest. The sky was clear, the stars shining overhead. She heard footsteps and looked up to see Brian approaching. He sat next to her without saying anything for a few seconds. "You look tired." She let out a short laugh. "I'm exhausted. But Oliver's getting better, and that's what matters." Brian nodded. "And you? How are you?" She turned to him, studying his face under the faint hospital lights. He looked genuinely concerned. He always did. And it was at that moment Emily realized she wasn't fighting what she felt anymore. There were no more walls between them. She didn't know when it had happened, but Brian Carter had become someone essential in her life. She wanted him. So, for the first time, she didn't run. Emily leaned forward slightly, watching to see if he would pull back. But Brian didn't move. He just waited, as if he knew this moment would come. Then she closed her eyes and kissed him. The kiss was soft at first, hesitant. But when Brian's lips responded, everything made sense. He held her face in his hands, deepening the kiss, pulling her closer. It was warmth, it was safety, it was something Emily didn't know she needed until that moment. When they pulled apart, Brian rested his forehead against hers, breathing deeply. "Does this mean you're going to stop running?" Emily smiled. "I think so." Brian stroked her face, and in his eyes, she saw something she had never seen before. Something that made her sure she was exactly where she was meant to be. That night, Emily finally accepted that she was in love with Brian Carter. And this time, there was nothing left to deny it. Emily didn't know how long she stayed there, feeling Brian's breath so close to hers. The kiss still burned on her lips, and her heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to memorize that feeling, to understand how she had gotten to this point. But at the same time, she didn't want to think too much. For the first time, she didn't want to run. Brian brushed a strand of hair from her face, his gray eyes looking at her with something she couldn't name, but that left her feeling vulnerable. It was as if he truly saw her, beyond the walls she had spent her life building. "Will you regret this tomorrow?" His voice was low, almost a whisper. Emily felt a small smile form at the corner of her lips. "I think I'm past the point of regrets." Brian smiled too, but there was a serious look in his expression. "So, does this mean you'll give me a chance?" She sighed, looking down for a moment. Part of her wanted to give in completely, but another part still carried scars that couldn't be ignored. "I don't know how to do this, Brian. I never have." He held her hand between his, without rush or pressure. "We can figure it out together." Emily looked at him and realized she had never wanted to try something as much as she wanted to try with him. The following days were different. After that moment at the hospital, nothing was the same. Brian stayed by her side, supporting Oliver's recovery and making sure she had everything she needed. But it wasn't just that. He was there for her, and Emily knew it. Their conversations became lighter, their glances more intense, their goodbyes longer. Until finally, Oliver was discharged from the hospital. It was a day filled with relief and joy, but it also marked the moment when Emily had to face reality. The restaurant was in her name now. It was time to decide what to do with it. And of course, Brian was by her side when she stepped into the space for the first time since it had closed. The scent of old wood and memories surrounded her immediately. Emily walked through the dusty hall, running her fingers over the tables covered with old sheets. Every corner of that place held a piece of her childhood, her family, a time when everything felt simpler. Brian watched her in silence, respecting the moment. She turned to him and smiled, feeling something warm grow in her chest. "I want to reopen this place," Brian nodded, as if he already knew the answer before she even said it. "Then let's make it happen." She blinked, surprised. "We?" He shrugged, crossing his arms. "I know a little about business. Maybe I can help." Emily narrowed her eyes, suspicious. "Are you trying to be my business partner, Carter?" Brian laughed, stepping closer. "Maybe I just want a reason to stick around." She felt her heart race again. "You don't need a reason." The words came out before she could think. And when she saw the light in his eyes, she knew there was no turning back. Brian pulled her by the waist, bringing her closer. "Then I guess I'm finally where I'm supposed to be." Emily smiled. The restaurant would reopen. Her brother was fine, and for the first time, she allowed herself to be happy without fear. But fate still had one last surprise for her. The next night, Brian took her to dinner. He said he wanted to celebrate, but Emily noticed something different about him. He seemed nervous. The restaurant wasn't fancy, wasn't filled with etiquette and rules. It was cozy, with soft lighting and an intimate atmosphere. Perfect for them. In the middle of dinner, Brian reached into his pocket. Emily watched as he placed a small box on the table. Her heart stopped. "Brian?" He took a deep breath and opened the box. A simple but elegant ring sparkled under the soft light of the restaurant. "Emily, I've never been a man who follows rules. I've never been good at showing what I feel. But you changed everything. I don't want to imagine my life without you anymore." Emily felt tears well up in her eyes. "Are you asking you to marry me?" He finished, holding her hand. "Not because it's too soon, not because it makes sense, but because I know it's you. I know I want you forever." She held back her tears, feeling her heart almost burst. Brian had always challenged her. He had always pushed her out of her comfort zone. But in that moment, he wasn't asking her to do something impossible. He was only asking her to accept happiness. She smiled, letting the tears fall. Yes. The answer came without hesitation, without doubt. Brian laughed, sliding the ring onto her finger before pulling her into a kiss full of promises. The restaurant would reopen. They were together. And finally, their fate was sealed. Emily still couldn't believe what had happened. The night before, Brian Carter, the man who had completely shaken up her life and her heart, had proposed to her. And she had said yes. No hesitation, no fear, just the certainty that this was what she wanted. After so many years running from love, doubting people's intentions, holding back to avoid getting hurt, she had finally found someone worth taking the risk for. But saying yes to Brian Carter's proposal wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. The next morning was chaotic. Emily's phone wouldn't stop ringing. First, Oliver freaked out when he heard the news. He had always been protective of his sister, so convincing him that this wasn't a huge mistake took some effort. Then, the restaurant became her priority. With renovations in full swing, Emily was working harder than ever to make sure everything was perfect for the reopening. And Brian, as he had promised, was right by her side. His involvement in the restaurant's renovation was surprising. For someone who had always been surrounded by luxury, Brian seemed to adapt well to this new environment. He helped choose furniture, attended meetings with suppliers, and occasionally even put on an apron to test recipes with her. Emily couldn't help but laugh when she saw him with flour on his face or complaining that cooking was harder than it looked. But what impressed her the most was his patience. He didn't try to control anything, didn't try to change anything. He was just there, like a true partner. But, as expected, not everything was smooth sailing. The news of their engagement hit the media like a bomb. Within hours, newspapers and websites were speculating about everything. Who was Emily? What did Brian Carter see in her? How long would this last? Isabella, his ex-girlfriend, wasted no time either. She gave interviews hinting that Emily was taking advantage of Brian's money, that he was blinded by passion, and that, in the end, this was nothing more than a passing whim. Emily tried to ignore it all, but it wasn't easy. Brian knew something was wrong when he found her sitting alone at the restaurant late at night, staring at her phone with a tired expression. "Are you okay?" Emily hesitated before answering. "I'm trying to be." He sat down next to her and gently took the phone from her hands, glancing at the headlines without showing any reaction. All this, she sighed. It feels like I've lost control of my own life. I used to be just an ordinary girl trying to get by. Now I'm Brian Carter's fiancée. And to the world, that seems to mean I'm not myself anymore. Brian stayed silent for a moment before speaking. You're still the same Emily you've always been. These people don't know you. They only see what they want to see. She looked at him, uncertain. And what do you see? He gave her a lopsided smile. I see the girl who hugged me the wrong way at the airport and turned my life upside down. And I've never been more grateful for a mistake. She laughed despite everything. Me too. Brian held her hand and kissed her fingers. Let me handle this, she frowned. Brian, I don't need you to solve my problems. I know. But sometimes letting someone help doesn't mean you're weak. It means you trust them. Emily realized he was right. She had spent so much time protecting herself that she had forgotten that accepting help could also be a sign of strength. The next day, Brian gave an exclusive interview to shut down all the rumors. He talked about how he and Emily had met, about the restaurant, and how their relationship had nothing to do with money or status. He was direct and sincere, and when he mentioned that Emily was the love of his life, it was impossible for the tabloids to keep pushing the narrative that she was just a passing interest. But the real turning point came when Isabella tried to make a comeback. She showed up at an important event where Brian was, and he completely ignored her. Not a glance, not a word. For the first time, the woman who had always thought she was in control realized she no longer had a place in his life. And for the first time, Emily felt that chapter of her life had truly closed. The restaurant was ready a week later. The opening was an emotional event. Oliver, standing by her side, helped coordinate everything, and Brian was there, watching the woman he loved finally achieve her dream. When the doors opened and the first customers walked in, Emily felt tears well up in her eyes. She had done it. The restaurant was back in business. And more than that, she was happy. That night, after a long day of work, Brian took her to the restaurant's balcony and looked into her eyes. I told you it would be a good investment. Emily smiled. You mean the restaurant or me? He laughed. Both. She wrapped her arms around his neck and sighed. I never imagined my life would lead me here. Brian cupped her face with both hands, gently stroking her skin with his thumbs. Now that you're here, what do you want? She didn't hesitate. I want you. Brian smiled and kissed her. And at that moment, Emily knew she was finally where she was meant to be. Time seemed to fly after Emily said yes. The restaurant was running just as she had always dreamed. Oliver was healthy and happy, and Brian was still there, like the missing piece she never knew she needed. But now, with the wedding approaching, she often found herself reflecting on everything that had happened. How had one simple mistake at the airport completely changed her life? Wedding preparations began almost immediately, and Emily quickly realized that planning a ceremony was no simple task. While Brian seemed relaxed about everything, making it clear he would do whatever she wanted, Emily found herself overwhelmed by a sea of decisions. Invitations, dresses, catering, decorations. It was a whirlwind of choices she never thought she'd have to make. I never thought planning a wedding would be this hard, she said, sinking into Brian's couch, surrounded by a pile of wedding magazines. Brian laughed, sitting beside her and picking up one of the magazines. You know, we could just elope and get married in secret, right? Emily gave him a playful look. Do you really think Oliver would forgive me for that? Brian grimaced. Fair point. But if it's getting too stressful, let me help. She sighed, taking his hand. You already help, just by being here. He squeezed her hand gently. I just want this day to be perfect for you. Emily knew that with Brian by her side, no matter what happened, that day would already be perfect. The news of the wedding spread quickly. Every newspaper wanted details, and every gossip site wanted to speculate about the ceremony. Emily tried to ignore it, but it was hard to see her name in headlines questioning her intentions or still comparing her to Isabella. But Brian was there to remind her of what truly mattered. The only opinion that matters is ours, he said, holding her face and looking into her eyes. Nothing else makes a difference, and he was right. The big day finally arrived. Emily looked at herself in the mirror, feeling her heart race. Her dress was simple, yet elegant, just as she had wanted. The soft fabric draped gently over her body, and her hair was styled in a delicate updo, with a few loose strands framing her face. Oliver walked into the room and stopped when he saw her. Wow, you look amazing. Emily smiled, holding back tears. Thank you, Ollie. He stepped closer and took her hands. I've never seen you this happy. She took a deep breath, trying to contain her emotions. "I am happy," he smiled. "Then I guess you're ready to marry that arrogant billionaire," she laughed. "Definitely." The ceremony was held in an outdoor garden, surrounded by flowers and delicate lights. Everything felt magical. Emily walked down the aisle, feeling the guests' eyes on her, but she only saw Brian standing at the altar, wearing a perfectly tailored suit and a smile filled with love. When she reached him, Brian took her hands and whispered, "You look breathtaking." Emily smiled, her heart pounding. The officiant began to speak, but she could hardly focus. All that mattered was the man standing in front of her, the man who had changed her life in ways she had never imagined. "Emily, do you take Brian as your husband, to love and honor him for all the days of your lives?" She looked into his eyes and felt a wave of certainty. "Yes." "Brian, do you take Emily as your wife, to love and honor her for all the days of your lives?" Brian's smile grew wider. "Yes, forever." Their kiss sealed the promise, and the sound of clapping and cheering from friends and family filled the air. But Emily only felt Brian, his hands gently holding her face, the warmth of knowing she had found her home. The reception was filled with laughter and joy. Oliver gave a heartfelt speech, saying he had never seen Emily so happy and that Brian had gained not just a wife, but also a brother. Brian, always playful, responded that he never wanted a younger brother, but he might make an exception for Oliver. They danced the night away, laughed, toasted, and celebrated the beginning of their new life together. At the end of the night, when they were finally alone, Brian pulled Emily into a tight embrace. "You're officially my wife now," Emily smiled, resting her head against his chest. "And you're officially my husband." Brian leaned in and kissed her tenderly. "Thank you for changing my life." She looked at him lovingly. "You changed mine too." And they knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it together, forever. What did you think of Emily and Brian's story? Share your thoughts in the comments. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What's your score? Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to follow all our stories. And don't forget to check out more heartwarming stories by clicking on the final screen.